Who was the last true Roman? Was it a teenage emperor deposed by barbarians, a warrior who held back the Huns, or a philosopher executed in a crumbling Gothic kingdom? For centuries, historians have debated which extraordinary soul deserves the title, the last Roman. But what if it wasn't one man, but many men who through blood, steel, and sacrifice kept alive the spirit of Rome long after the city had fallen? From generals and emperors to popes and philosophers, this is the story of those who stood against time itself to preserve an empire already lost. If you love epic tales from history that transport you across the ages, make sure to subscribe to Sleep Stories TV. Let the echoes of the past guide you to a night of calm and wonder. The Western Roman Empire faced its final crisis in April 476. In the spring of 476, the Western Roman Empire stood on the brink of collapse, its foundations eroded by decades of internal decay and relentless external pressure. The political stage was dominated not by emperors of noble Roman lineage, but by generals and warlords, many of them of Germanic origin, who held true power behind the scenes. One such figure, Orestes, a Roman general of Pannonian background, had recently taken control of the capital Ravenna. But rather than claiming the imperial title for himself, he made the fateful decision to place his teenage son, Romulus Augustulus, on the throne. In doing so, he hoped to maintain the illusion of Roman continuity while retaining de facto control. What Orestes did not anticipate was the growing unrest among the very Germanic troops that made up the backbone of his power. These soldiers, hardened and battle-scarred, demanded more than symbolic loyalty. They wanted land higher pay and recognition. When their requests were refused, they turned to a new leader, Odoacer, a chieftain of mixed Germanic and Romanized background. Odoacer was not content with bargaining or compromise. He and his supporters revolted, capturing and executing Orestes with brutal efficiency. Yet when the young Emperor Romulus was brought before him, Odoacer did not opt for bloodshed. Instead, he spared the boy's life and sent him into quiet exile in the countryside, stripping him of all authority. This seemingly merciful act carried profound historical weight. Romulus Augustulus's removal marked what historians would later call the end of the Western Roman Empire. No successor would be crowned in Rome. The symbols of imperial authority, the diadem, the purple robes, the scepter, were packed and sent eastward to Constantinople. Odoacer declared that one emperor based in the east was sufficient for the governance of the entire Roman world. Thus, while the empire continued in theory, in practical terms, the West ceased to be a sovereign political entity. But what does it truly mean for an empire to fall? Was it a single act, a violent rupture, or a long, painful decline? For the average citizen, life continued much as before. Farms were tended, taxes collected, and local elites still governed their domains. The real rupture occurred in the minds of rulers and historians. Rome had been the eternal city, the unbreakable force of civilization, and now its western half was a shadow. The crisis of 476 was less a single collapse than the final breath of a wounded giant. And yet the soul of Rome did not perish with Romulus Augustulus. It lived on in the form of warriors, philosophers, and visionaries who sought to defend and preserve Roman identity, law, and culture in an increasingly fragmented world. This was not the end of Rome. It was the beginning of a long, drawn-out epilogue filled with men who would be remembered as the last Romans. Odoacer's rise marked the symbolic end of Roman imperial rule. When Odoacer rose to power in the aftermath of Romulus, Augustulus's deposition, the ancient office of Western Roman Emperor was left vacant not just in name, but in meaning. No longer would Italy be ruled by a Caesar cloaked in purple, chosen by the Senate or hailed by the legions. Odoacer, though technically recognizing the supremacy of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, established his own rule over Italy, not as a Roman emperor, but as a rex, a king. It was a seismic shift, not simply a transfer of power, but a redefinition of authority. The old Roman hierarchy, based on the Senate, the consuls, and the emperor, was displaced by a system rooted in Germanic kingship and military dominance. Yet, in an ironic twist of fate, Odoacer maintained many outward appearances of Roman governance. He preserved the Senate, kept much of the Roman administrative apparatus intact, and even minted coins bearing the image of the Eastern Emperor. To many inhabitants of Italy, especially those in urban centers, this continuity might have masked the magnitude of the change. But make no mistake, symbolically, the Roman imperial ideal in the West had ended. The regalia of empire was now kept in Constantinople, a distant capital that many Westerners would never see. The unity of East and West, always tenuous, was now shattered. For centuries, emperors had embodied the divine right to rule, blending Roman law, military command, and religious sanctity. Odoacer did not claim this divine mantle. His legitimacy rested not on ancient rites or Senate decrees, but on the support of his Germanic warriors. This new political reality reflected the evolution of power in late antiquity, from institutions to individuals, from law to force. Rome's long-standing dream of universality. The idea of one empire under one emperor had fractured beyond repair. What remained was a mosaic of kingdoms, client states, and local strongmen, all bearing traces of Roman influence, but no longer ruled from Rome. Still, Odoacer's rule was not a reign of chaos. His 17-year tenure brought a measure of stability to a war-torn peninsula. He negotiated with the Eastern court, defended the realm from external threats, and oversaw the everyday workings of government. But the symbolism of his ascent was unmistakable. The Emperor of Rome had been replaced by a barbarian king. And yet this moment did not signal the end of the Roman spirit. It marked its transformation. For even as the imperial line ended in Italy, others rose to carry Rome's legacy forward. Throughout the following centuries, many would try to revive the imperial tradition. From generals wielding Latin swords to popes bearing Roman titles, the ghost of empire lingered. And Odoacer's rise, paradoxically, became both the end of an age and the beginning of a myth. The idea that somewhere, somehow, Rome still lived on. The concept of the last Roman captivated historians for centuries. Across the centuries, scholars, poets, and chroniclers have grappled with a tantalizing question. Who was the last true Roman? Not merely in title, but in spirit. Who best embodied the ideals of the ancient empire in its final days? This question has haunted historical imagination since antiquity, inspiring endless debates and countless candidates. The notion of a last Roman is more than an academic exercise. It is a symbol of defiance against decline, a beacon of continuity amidst chaos. To call someone the last Roman is to suggest that through valor, intellect, or devotion, they upheld the fading virtues of an empire long past its prime. Early historians, like Procopius, were among the first to elevate individuals as inheritors of Rome's dying light. Later, Enlightenment thinkers, such as Edward Gibbon, popularized the term in grand narratives of imperial collapse. Gibbon, in particular, admired figures who stood against the tide of barbarism and corruption. For him, the last Roman was not merely a man, but an ideal, a final defense of classical civilization. His works painted generals like Stilicho and Boethius as tragic heroes doomed to fail, but noble in their resistance. But the title was never restricted to soldiers alone. Philosophers like Boethius, politicians like Cassiodorus, and even religious leaders such as Pope Gregory the Great have all been dubbed last Romans in various contexts. Each embodied a different aspect of what Rome had once represented: military strength, intellectual legacy, civic duty, or moral leadership. Over time, the phrase last Roman became a kind of elegy for a world slipping into the Middle Ages, a lament for order lost and greatness forsaken. This fascination also reflects a deeper human desire to witness endurance in the face of inevitable change. As the Western Empire dissolved into fragmented kingdoms and shifting alliances, some individuals seemed to resist entropy itself. They spoke Latin when others had forgotten. It honored institutions that had decayed and clung to dreams of unity, even as their worlds collapsed. The last Romans were not just survivors, they were visionaries who tried to rescue the soul of a civilization. Indeed, the list of potential last Romans spans centuries and continents. Some were born before the fall of the West and died after it. Others lived in distant provinces, preserving Roman customs long after the emperors were gone. And still others were remembered only through legend, perhaps even transformed into mythic figures like King Arthur. This ambiguity is part of the allure. There is no single answer, no definitive name. The last Roman is both a historical figure and a timeless archetype. In a sense, the obsession with the last Roman is also about legacy, how civilizations end and what, if anything, survives. It asks whether greatness can truly disappear, or whether echoes of Rome endure in the minds and deeds of those who refuse to let it die. To trace the story of these last torchbearers is to walk through the twilight of an empire and listen for the final heartbeat of a world once called eternal. Flavius Stilicho fought valiantly to defend a crumbling Western empire. In the final years of the 4th century, when the Western Roman Empire was already showing signs of irreversible decline, one man rose through the ranks to become its most stalwart defender, Flavius Stilicho. A seasoned general of mixed Roman and Vandal heritage, Stilicho possessed not only military genius, but a deep loyalty to the imperial order. He served as Magister Militum, master of soldiers, under the great emperor Theodosius III. And upon Theodosius's death, Stilicho was entrusted with the guardianship of the Western Empire and the boy emperor Honorius. It was a trust he would honor with tireless devotion, fighting both foreign invaders and internal intrigues in an effort to keep the West from unraveling. Stilicho's challenges were monumental. He had to face waves of Germanic tribes pressing on the frontiers, the ever-growing threat of the Visigoths under Alaric, and a deeply unstable court riddled with betrayal. Yet despite these odds, Stilicho managed to secure several important victories. He held the northern borders, repelled major invasions, and even negotiated temporary peace with powerful barbarian leaders. His strategy was not merely brute force, but a careful balance of diplomacy and warfare. He understood that Rome could no longer dominate its enemies outright. It had to outmaneuver them. Perhaps his greatest triumph came in 402, when Alaric invaded Italy. Stilicho responded with swiftness and precision, eventually forcing the Visigoths to retreat after a series of engagements. His victory was hailed as a miracle in an age of fear, and for a moment, it seemed as though Rome might yet endure. But Stilicho's successes made him enemies, especially among jealous courtiers and xenophobic senators who distrusted his Germanic bloodline. Despite everything he had done for the empire, his position grew increasingly precarious. In 408, the ultimate betrayal came. Under the influence of his advisors and seeking to assert independence from his powerful general, Emperor Honorius, ordered Stilicho's arrest. The man who had defended the empire for decades was executed without trial, his reputation smeared by false accusations of treason. It was a catastrophic mistake. With Stilicho gone, the fragile balance he had maintained collapsed. Within 2 years, Rome was sacked for the first time in over 800 years, an unthinkable event that shocked the entire world. Stilicho's death is often seen as a turning point, a moment when Rome discarded its last real chance at survival in the West. He was not perfect, and his strategies were not always successful, but few doubted his commitment to the empire's survival. Edward Gibbon famously called him the last of the Romans, a title that has endured through generations of scholarship. Stilicho embodied the martial discipline, administrative skill, and sense of duty that had once defined Roman greatness. Even in an age of decline, he upheld the ideals of the Republic and the Empire alike. His story is a tragic reminder that loyalty is no safeguard in a world collapsing under its own contradictions. The very state Stilicho tried to protect turned against him. But in the long arc of history, his legacy remains untarnished. He was the general who stood against chaos, the last sword raised in defense of a fading world. Constantius III briefly stabilized the empire after Stilicho's fall. In the turbulent wake of Stilicho's unjust execution, the Western Roman Empire spiraled into disorder. The Gothic forces that Stilicho had long kept in check ravaged Italy, and Rome itself suffered a humiliating sack in 410, an act that echoed across the ancient world like a death knell for the empire. Yet, out of this maelstrom of fear and confusion, a new leader emerged to bring a fragile sense of order. His name was Constantius, later known as Constantius III, a military commander from Illyricum, who would become the empire's final hope for brief resurgence. Constantius was not a grand orator or a visionary reformer. He was a soldier's soldier. His strength lay in logistics, discipline, and strategic command. Appointed Magister Militum in 411, he inherited a realm torn apart by rival claimants to the throne, disloyal generals, and entrenched barbarian forces occupying Roman provinces. It was a grim landscape, but Constantius proved more than equal to the challenge. He moved quickly to suppress usurpers reclaiming territories in Gaul and Hispania that had slipped into the hands of enemies during the chaotic years following Stilicho's death. One of Constantius's most notable achievements was forcing the Visigoths into submission, not through open warfare alone, but through a clever siege in northern Hispania. Cut off from supplies and surrounded by Roman forces, the Visigoths, under their king Wallia, were starved into negotiation. Rather than annihilate them, Constantius offered a pragmatic deal. The Goths would become federati allies bound by oath to fight for Rome. It was a tactical victory that not only subdued a major threat, but transformed it into a valuable military asset. The Visigoths would go on to fight Rome's battles for years, sometimes as friends, sometimes as rivals. Constantius also secured a critical political alliance by marrying Galla Placidia, the sister of Emperor Honorius and daughter of Theodosius I. This marriage cemented his status at court and made him the de facto ruler of the West. In 421, Honorius formally recognized Constantius as co-emperor, elevating him to the highest position of power. For a brief moment, the Western Empire had a strong hand at the helm, a capable general who had both military control and dynastic legitimacy. But this hopeful moment was fleeting. Only months after his elevation, Constantius fell ill and died. His reign as emperor lasted just 7 months. His death was more than a personal tragedy. It marked the end of the last substantial stabilization effort before the Western Empire's final unraveling. Without Constantius's unifying presence, the empire's enemies seized the initiative. The Vandals continued their destructive march through Hispania and into North Africa. Meanwhile, Rome's remaining provinces began slipping through its fingers, either falling to barbarian kingdoms or breaking off into autonomous remnants. Despite his short time in power, Constantius III left behind a legacy of resilience. He did not seek glory through grand proclamations or conquest. Instead, he understood that survival was the highest virtue in a collapsing world. He bought the West a little more time, a few more years of breathing room in which remnants of Roman law culture and military discipline could still function. His life was a brief candle in the growing darkness, a final reminder that with the right leadership, even a dying empire could still stand tall. In the long saga of the Western Roman Empire, Constantius is often overshadowed by more flamboyant figures. But for those who study the slow fall of Rome, he is remembered as the quiet architect of one last reprieve, a man who held the line even as the foundations beneath him crumbled. Count Boniface died defending Africa against the invading Vandals. As the Western Roman Empire struggled to hold itself together in Europe, another crisis was brewing to the south in the vital province of Africa. This land, rich with grain and wealth, had long been Rome's breadbasket, supplying food and resources to Italy and the Western court. But by the 420s, it was no longer safe from external threats. A once fringe barbarian group, the Vandals had been steadily moving westward through Hispania. Under the cunning and ambitious leadership of their king Gaiseric, they had set their sights on Africa. It would be up to Count Boniface, one of Rome's last competent military commanders, to defend the province, and it would cost him everything. Boniface had served Rome for decades. He was a respected general who had proven himself in previous campaigns and earned a reputation for both bravery and integrity. When Africa came under threat, he He was its last line of defense. But his situation was complicated by politics back in Italy. The Western Empire, already fractured, was consumed by internal rivalries. Boniface's rivals in Ravenna spread rumors that he was a traitor. At one point, he was recalled to Italy, only to be reinstated when the empire realized no one else could defend Africa effectively. As the Vandals launched their invasion in 429, Boniface found himself isolated. The Roman navy had weakened, reinforcements were scarce, and political trust had been shattered. Still, he prepared the defenses and met Geiseric's forces head-on. At the Battle of Calama, Boniface fought bravely, but the Vandals proved too powerful, too mobile, and too relentless. Defeated, Boniface withdrew to the city of Hippo Regius, where he prepared for a desperate siege. Within the walls of the city was none other than St. Augustine, one of Christianity's greatest theologians, who would die during the siege. The Vandals besieged Hippo for over a year, and although Boniface held out longer than anyone thought possible, the pressure was unbearable. Eventually, reinforcements did arrive from the Eastern Empire, led by the powerful general Asper. Boniface joined forces with him and marched once again to confront the Vandals. But this second effort also ended in failure. Gaiseric, ever the master strategist, outmaneuvered the Roman forces and secured yet another decisive victory. Africa was effectively lost. Soon after Carthage, the province's capital and one of the greatest cities in the Roman world, fell to the Vandals. It would become the seat of a new kingdom that would last for a century. Defeated, but not disgraced, Boniface returned to Italy only to become entangled in yet another civil war, this time against his longtime rival, Flavius Aetius. In one final act of loyalty to Rome, Boniface led his troops into battle once more. Though he managed to win the engagement, he was mortally wounded in the fighting. With his death, the empire lost one of its last genuine defenders, a general who had done all he could to preserve Roman Africa, and who died trying to hold back the tide. Historians like Procopius later remembered Boniface as the last of the Romans, a title bestowed not because of titles or victories, but because of spirit. He embodied what was left of the Roman soul duty in the face of betrayal courage, amidst collapse and loyalty to a state that had failed him. The fall of Africa was not merely a territorial loss, it was a moral and logistical catastrophe for the Western Empire. Without its grain, Italy starved. Without its wealth, the armies weakened. And without men, like Boniface, Rome stood increasingly alone. His life is a testament to the harsh truth of the late empire. Sometimes even the noblest efforts are not enough. But through his courage, Boniface ensured that the final chapters of Roman Africa would be written in defiance, not surrender. Flavius Aetius battled Attila and held the West together for decades. In an age defined by fragmentation and betrayal, Flavius Aetius stood out as the last true pillar holding up the crumbling edifice of the Western Roman Empire. A seasoned general diplomat and political survivor, Aetius was not only a product of Rome's martial traditions, he was their embodiment. Born into a time of rising chaos, he matured in the crucible of war and exile, having spent his formative years as a hostage in both the Visigothic and Hunnic courts. These early experiences gave him an unmatched understanding of Rome's enemies and would prove invaluable when the empire's very survival hung in the balance. Rising through the military ranks during the turbulent 420s, Aetius quickly distinguished himself through campaigns in Gaul, where he both subdued rebellious provinces and forged alliances with Germanic tribes. Unlike many Roman leaders of the time who viewed the so-called barbarians with disdain or fear, Aetius understood the necessity of cooperation. He built a personal network of loyalty that extended from Roman senators to Gothic kings and Hunnic warlords. It was this pragmatic vision that allowed him to rule not merely as a general, but as the unchallenged power behind the Western throne for 2 decades. But Aetius's legacy would be defined by a single epic confrontation, his clash with Attila the Hun. In the early 450s, Attila, the Scourge of God, launched a full-scale invasion of Gaul. His coalition was vast, made up of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and other allied tribes. It was perhaps the most formidable force ever assembled against the Western Roman Empire. Rome alone could not withstand it. So Aetius did the unthinkable. He rallied a diverse alliance of Romans, Visigoths, Franks, and other former enemies into a single army. Together, they met Attila on the Catalonian plains in 451. The battle was immense and ferocious. Though the Roman alliance suffered heavy casualties, they managed to repel Attila's advance. The Visigothic king Theodoric III died in battle, a powerful symbol of shared sacrifice between Romans and Federates. While not a total annihilation of the Huns, the engagement blunted their momentum and forced their withdrawal. It was one of the last great military victories of the Western Empire, and it would never have been possible without Aetius. His leadership, his diplomacy, and his deep knowledge of Hunnic strategy turned what could have been a final disaster into a hard-won reprieve. Aetius's reward for saving the empire, however, was not honor or promotion. It was betrayal. In 454, during a moment of perceived peace, the emperor, Valentinian III, murdered Aetius with his own hand, reportedly driven by jealousy and paranoia. The act shocked even the Roman court. One noble is said to have told the emperor afterward, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." The prophecy proved true. Within a year, Valentinian himself was assassinated, and the fragile balance Aetius had maintained shattered. The consequences of Aetius's murder were swift and dire. With no central authority strong enough to keep federated troops in line, the Vandals soon sailed from North Africa and sacked Rome in 455. In the decades that followed, the Western Empire became little more than a collection of quarreling warlords and powerless emperors. Aetius had been the last to unify it through strength, cunning, and personal charisma. Once he was gone, there would be no one else capable of doing the same. Flavius Aetius is often called the last of the Romans, not only because of his final stand against Attila, but because he was the last Roman general to truly command the empire's respect and its armies. He wielded power, not through fear, but through competence. He did not simply delay Rome's fall. He preserved its dignity in its final years. His story is one of glory, resilience, and tragic loss. A tale that captures the very essence of what it meant to be Roman at the end of the Roman world. Majorian almost restored the empire before betrayal sealed his fate. In the long twilight of the Western Roman Empire, when emperors were little more than puppets, and the true power lay in the hands of barbarian generals or scheming elites, one man dared to break the cycle. His name was Majorian, and for a brief blazing moment, he brought hope back to an empire most had already abandoned. Rising to power, in 457. Majorian was not born into royalty, but forged his career through military distinction. A protege of the great general Aetius, he understood both the battlefield and the court. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Majorian had a vision. He wanted to restore Rome, not merely its territory, but its honor. At the time of his ascension, the Western Empire was a fractured shell. Gaul was in chaos, Hispania barely under control, and North Africa completely lost to the Vandals. The Eastern court viewed the West with a mix of pity and contempt. Yet Majorian launched a sweeping campaign of reform and reconquest, determined to restore order. He took bold steps, passing laws to protect public infrastructure, encouraging the repair of aqueducts and temples, and curbing the corruption of the aristocracy. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to rebuild. Militarily, Majorian's ambitions were even more astonishing. Against all odds, he launched successful campaigns into Gaul and Hispania. He defeated the Visigoths, forced the Burgundians into submission, and reasserted imperial control over vast regions that had been thought permanently lost. His victories weren't just military triumphs, they were symbols. The Western Empire was not dead yet. Majorian made the Roman name feared and respected once again on the battlefield, but his most daring project was yet to come, the reconquest of North Africa. For years, the Vandals had used their new kingdom as a base for piracy and raids threatening Italy's food supply and economy. Majorian sought to end this by building the largest Western Roman fleet seen in generations. Assembled near Carthago Nova in Hispania, the fleet numbered hundreds of ships and was meant to sail straight into the heart of Vandal territory. It was a gamble, but it could have changed history. Tragically, before the fleet ever set sail, it was destroyed, sabotaged at anchor, likely by agents in the pay of the Vandals or Roman traders aligned with Ricimer, the powerful magister militum, who had elevated Majorian to the throne. With his navy gone, Majorian's grand plan collapsed. Still, he did not give up. He began his return to Italy, hoping to regroup and try again. But along the way, he made a fatal mistake. He dismissed much of his army, traveling with only a small guard. Ricimer, threatened by Majorian's independence and popularity, seized the opportunity. In 461, he intercepted the emperor near the city of Tortona. Majorian was arrested, imprisoned, and brutally executed. His reign had lasted just 4 years. Yet in that short span, he had accomplished more than most emperors of the century. He was one of the last to dream of a revitalized Rome, and one of the very few to come close to achieving it. Majorian's death marked the end of any serious effort to restore the Western Roman Empire. After him, the emperors were weaker, the generals more self-serving, and the provinces continued to slip away. But his legacy endured. He was a warrior emperor who not only led from the front, but governed with foresight and justice. To many historians, Majorian stands as one of the last true Romans, imperial in spirit, courageous in action, and tragically doomed by a world that no longer deserved him. Emperor Anthemius gave everything in his doomed African campaign. In the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, most emperors were little more than figureheads, chosen and discarded by powerful generals like Ricimer, who held the real authority. But there were exceptions. Among them stood Emperor Anthemius, a man sent from the east, not to passively oversee decline, but to actively try to reverse it. Appointed in 467 by the Eastern Roman Emperor Leo III, Anthemius was a seasoned statesman with noble ancestry and a genuine desire to restore the West. Unlike many of his predecessors, he did not see his rule as symbolic. He sought action reform and military recovery. From the moment he arrived in the West, Anthemius threw himself into the daunting task of saving what remained of the empire. He took up residence in Rome, an increasingly rare decision at the time, signaling his intent to reestablish imperial presence and authority in the heart of the ancient capital. But he also recognized that the most immediate threat to the survival of the West came not from the crumbling Senate or rebellious generals, but from the Vandals in North Africa. The province of Africa, once Rome's granary, had become a pirate haven under Vandal control. From Carthage, they launched devastating raids on the Italian coast, crippling the economy and starving the cities. Anthemius knew that reclaiming Africa was key to restoring the West. And so he did something no emperor had done, and he coordinated a grand joint military campaign with the East. With Leo's support, a massive naval fleet, one of the largest ever assembled by the Eastern Roman Empire, was prepared under the command of the patrician Basiliscus. Anthemius, for his part, sent Marcellinus, a loyal general, from Dalmatia to aid the assault. It was a rare moment of unity and coordination between the two halves of the empire. Hopes soared that the Vandals might finally be driven from Africa and the empire restored to some semblance of its former glory. But everything went wrong. Basiliscus, though a man of high rank, proved disastrously incompetent. Fooled by the cunning Vandal king Gaiseric and his deceptive peace offers, Basiliscus delayed his attack and left the fleet vulnerable. In a sudden strike, the Vandals launched a surprise fireship assault, setting much of the Roman fleet ablaze. The campaign collapsed in ashes. Marcellinus was assassinated soon after, possibly by agents of Ricimer, and Anthemius's grand strategy dissolved into failure. The loss was not just military, it was psychological. The West would never again mount such an ambitious effort to reclaim lost territories. Still, Anthemius did not retreat into despair. He continued to rule with resolve, forming new alliances, supporting provincial defenses, and calling upon aid from distant corners of the old empire. He even appealed to Riotimus, a Romano-British leader, to support him in Gaul against the Visigoths. But every effort was undermined by one persistent adversary, Ricimer. Suspicious of Anthemius's independence and Eastern background, Ricimer resented the emperor's refusal to be a puppet. Tensions grew until civil war erupted. Ricimer laid siege to Rome itself in 472, bringing his personal army to depose the man he had once endorsed. The fighting was brutal, a bitter echo of Rome's internal divisions. After months of resistance, Ricimer's forces finally broke into the city. Anthemius, still defiant, was captured and executed. He had ruled for 5 years, an eternity, for a Western Roman emperor at that point, and had done more than most to actually defend and rebuild the state. He died not in exile or retreat, but on the front lines of a collapsing world. Anthemius is remembered as one of the last emperors to truly act like a Roman ruler. He had vision, strategy, and courage. He understood that the empire's problems could not be solved through appeasement or inertia. He risked everything in a desperate gamble to save Africa, and though he failed his willingness to fight until the very end, sets him apart. His reign was a final flare of imperial ambition, a reminder that even in its final breath, the Western Roman Empire could still produce leaders who embodied its ancient dignity. Julius Nepos ruled from Dalmatia after being deposed in Italy. As the Western Roman Empire drew closer to its inevitable demise, one last official emperor attempted to cling to legitimacy, not from Italy, the heartland of the empire, but from the rocky shores of Dalmatia across the Adriatic Sea. His name was Julius Nepos, and though he was overthrown in the West, he continued to rule in exile, still recognized by the Eastern Roman Empire as the rightful Western emperor. His story is a complex one, a tale of fractured authority betrayal and a last desperate hold on imperial dignity in an era when the very idea of Rome was being rewritten. Julius Nepos came to power in 474, appointed by the Eastern Emperor Leo I to replace Glycerius, a usurper installed by the powerful Burgundian general Gundobad. Nepos was not just a political pawn. He was the son-in-law of a former emperor and a respected military leader in his own right, backed by Constantinople and carrying the authority of the East. He arrived in Italy with high hopes of restoring order. He quickly forced Glycerius to abdicate and took the imperial throne in Ravenna. But the reality on the ground was far more hostile than he expected. The real power in Italy, by this time, was no longer held by emperors, but by generals. Chief among them was Orestes, a former officer who soon revolted against Nepos. In 475, barely a year after becoming emperor, Nepos was overthrown and forced to flee across the sea to Dalmatia. Most assumed that his rule was over. However, unlike so many other deposed emperors, Julius Nepos did not disappear into obscurity. Instead, he set up a court in exile and continued to rule his provincial territory as emperor in name all, while maintaining recognition from the Eastern Roman court. Meanwhile, Orestes placed his own son, the teenage Romulus Augustulus, on the throne. But this puppet regime would not last long. In 476, Odoacer, leader of a Germanic mercenary force, deposed Romulus and abolished the office of Western Emperor altogether, at least in Italy. Yet even then, Julius Nepos remained a thorn in the new regime's side. He refused to relinquish his claim and planned to one day return to Italy. Officially, Constantinople still acknowledged him as the Emperor of the West, making Romulus and later Odoacer mere usurpers in the eyes of the Eastern Empire. Nepos ruled from Dalmatia for several more years, issuing decrees, minting coins, and plotting his comeback. But the political landscape continued to shift. As the memory of unified Roman rule faded, Nepos's claim became more symbolic than practical. In 480, his life came to a sudden and violent end. Assassinated by two of his own generals, possibly acting under orders from enemies in Italy, he died without ever reclaiming his throne. With his death, the final connection to the official line of Western Roman emperors was severed. What makes Julius Nepos so remarkable is not the breadth of his power, but the tenacity of his claim. In a world where imperial titles were increasingly meaningless, Nepos clung to the old idea of legitimacy. He stood as the last officially recognized Western Roman emperor, the final flicker of a system that had once ruled the known world. Though he died far from Rome and never again set foot in Italy, His title and determination kept the ghost of the Western Empire alive a few years longer. Historians often debate whether Romulus, Augustulus, or Julius Nepos should be considered the true last emperor of the West. While Romulus ruled from Ravenna and was the last to wear the purple in Italy, it was Nepos who held legal recognition and imperial intention. In that sense, he represents not only a final ruler, but a final hope that somehow, through diplomacy, loyalty, and perseverance, the Western Roman Empire could be revived. It wasn't, of course, but Julius Nepos died still believing it might be. Syagrius held out in Gaul, long after Rome's official fall. As the last Western emperors fell and barbarian kingdoms spread across the old provinces, one Roman stronghold in the north refused to fade quietly into history. In the region of northern Gaul, centered around Soissons, a Roman commander named Syagrius maintained authority long after Rome's central government had collapsed. Known to some chroniclers as the King of the Romans, Syagrius upheld Roman laws, led Roman troops, and kept Roman administration intact despite being surrounded on all sides by rising Germanic powers. His story is one of improbable survival and defiant resistance, a final ember of empire smoldering in a land rapidly changing. Syagrius inherited command from his father, Aegidius, a general who had also broken with the central authority in Italy after Emperor Majorian's assassination. Aegidius had refused to recognize the puppet emperors imposed by Ricimer, and instead maintained loyalty to the Eastern Empire while ruling Gaul with autonomy. When Aegidius died around 464, Syagrius assumed leadership. Though never crowned emperor, he functioned as a de facto ruler, commanding an army enforcing Roman law and representing a continuation of imperial tradition. For over 2 decades, Syagrius preserved this isolated Roman enclave. His territory was not insignificant. It spanned from the Loire River to parts of modern-day Belgium. He managed diplomatic relations with neighboring powers, including the Visigoths to the south and the Franks to the northeast. His ability to hold his position amid increasing pressure from these tribes is a testament to his political and military skill. Roman cities in his domain continued to operate with some semblance of normalcy. Their infrastructure intact, their senates still convening. In many ways, Syagrius preserved the last true functioning piece of the Western Roman Empire. But the balance was fragile. When Clovis I ascended to leadership of the Salian Franks, in the late 480s, he began a campaign of aggressive expansion. Young, ambitious, and already victorious in multiple battles, Clovis saw Syagrius's territory as both a strategic prize and a symbol. Conquering it would mean erasing the final remnant of Roman rule in the West. In 486, the two forces met at the Battle of Soissons. Syagrius's army fought valiantly, but it was ultimately defeated by Clovis's superior numbers and momentum. Following his defeat, Syagrius fled to the Visigoths, hoping for refuge under King Alaric II. But politics in this new age were ruthless. Fearing retaliation from Clovis, the Visigoths handed Syagrius over. Clovis had him executed shortly after. It was an ignominious end for a man who had preserved Rome's traditions against all odds. Yet Syagrius's death marked more than just the fall of a man. It was the final extinguishing of Roman political authority in Gaul. Despite his defeat, Syagrius left a lasting impact. The institutions he maintained became part of the foundation for the Merovingian kingdom that Clovis established. Many of Syagrius's Roman administrators and military officers were absorbed into Frankish service. The very survival of Latin-based culture and administration in Gaul owes much to this period of resistance. It's no coincidence that French, a Romance language, would eventually dominate the region, rather than a Germanic tongue. To French historians especially, Syagrius is sometimes honored as the last Roman. Not because he held the title of emperor or ruled from Rome, but because he upheld the values and systems of the Roman world in a land where everything else had changed. In a time when others surrendered to the inevitable, Syagrius stood firm. His was a quiet defiance, a continuation of law, order, and civilization amid the swirl of conquest and chaos. His story is often overlooked in grand narratives of Rome's fall, but it deserves its place among the most poignant. For in that isolated corner of Gaul, as in Dalmatia, under Julius Nepos, the Roman world survived just a little bit longer, fading not with fire and fury, but with loyalty and resolve. Boethius and Cassiodorus preserved Roman ideals under Gothic rule. As the Western Roman Empire faded into history, and Italy came under the rule of the Ostrogoths, it might have seemed that the age of Roman thought, law, and learning had come to an end. Yet remarkably, in this new world, ruled by a Germanic elite, the intellectual flame of Rome continued to burn, thanks in no small part to two extraordinary men, Boethius and Cassiodorus. Though neither held military command nor ruled as emperors, both played a vital role in preserving the ideals, values, and cultural achievements of Roman civilization. They were scholars, statesmen, and visionaries who ensured that Rome's intellectual legacy would endure through the Dark Ages and beyond. Boethius, born into a noble Roman family in the late 5th century, was a philosopher, mathematician, and high-ranking official in the Ostrogothic court of King Theodoric the Great. Fluent in both Latin and Greek, he sought to translate and preserve the knowledge of the ancient world, especially the works of Plato and Aristotle, for future generations. His mission was clear: to act as a bridge between the classical past and the Christian present, ensuring that Roman wisdom would not be lost in the tides of time. Appointed Magister Officiorum, one of the highest administrative posts, Boethius wielded real power in the Gothic government and worked diligently to maintain the Roman administrative system under foreign rule. But Boethius's greatest legacy came not from his political work, but from his writing, especially his masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy. Written while imprisoned and awaiting execution, the text blends classical philosophy with Christian ethics in a profound meditation on fate, justice, and the human soul. It became one of the most influential works in medieval Europe, copied and read for centuries. Boethius was executed in 524, accused of treason by Theodoric, likely due to religious and political tensions. But in his final act, writing a philosophical dialogue in defense of reason and virtue, he affirmed the deepest ideals of Rome: the pursuit of wisdom, justice, and moral integrity. Cassiodorus, a contemporary and colleague of Boethius, followed a different but equally critical path. Also born into a Roman senatorial family, Cassiodorus served in the Gothic court, and eventually succeeded Boethius as Magister Officiorum. Like Boethius, he sought to preserve Roman law rhetoric and history under Gothic rule. He worked closely with King Theodoric and his successors, helping to integrate Roman governance with Ostrogothic customs. His vast knowledge of law, theology, and administration made him a central figure in the cultural survival of the Roman world during this transitional period. But Cassiodorus's most enduring contribution came later in life, after he withdrew from politics. Retreating to a monastery in southern Italy, he founded the Vivarium, a scholarly community devoted to the preservation of classical texts. He recognized that the only way to safeguard Roman literature, science, and theology was to copy it painstakingly, word by word. He encouraged monks to become scholars and scribes, turning Christian monasteries into bastions of classical learning. It was Cassiodorus's vision that helped create the scriptoria that would preserve so much of Greco-Roman literature through the centuries. Together, Boethius and Cassiodorus were more than intellectuals, they were stewards of a dying world. They saw the fragility of the civilization they had inherited and dedicated their lives to preserving its wisdom. In a time when swords often spoke louder than words, they chose the pen, and through that choice, they ensured that Rome's voice would echo through the ages. Their works laid the foundation for medieval education, Renaissance revival, and even modern philosophical thought. Though neither wore armor nor sat upon a throne, Boethius and Cassiodorus exemplified what it meant to be Roman in the truest sense. Their love of knowledge, commitment to justice, and belief in the enduring value of tradition made them worthy heirs to the Roman legacy. In preserving the past, they gave shape to the future. In that sense, they were not only the last Romans, they were also the first custodians of a new world yet to come. Belisarius and Justinian tried to reconquer the western provinces, long after the Western Roman Empire had fallen, and long after the last emperors of the West had been deposed. There remained one powerful city that still bore the torch of Roman authority, Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, had survived the storm. From its marble palaces and fortified walls, it continued to claim lineage from Augustus and Constantine. And under the reign of Emperor Justinian, that claim would become more than ceremonial. Justinian did not just inherit the Roman legacy, he intended to reclaim it, to reunify the empire by force. To do so, he called upon his greatest weapon, the general Belisarius. Justinian's ambition was staggering. Ascending the throne in 527, he saw himself not merely as ruler of the East, but as emperor of a united Roman world. His vision was to restore the lost western provinces, Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, and to reestablish Roman law, order, and culture across the Mediterranean. This was not mere nostalgia. To Justinian, the empire's fragmentation was a wound in history, one that he believed he could heal. But the task ahead was immense. The western lands were now ruled by Germanic kings. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in Africa, the Visigoths in Hispania, each entrenched and powerful. Justinian would need a military genius to overcome them. That genius was Flavius Belisarius, born of humble origin in Thrace. Belisarius quickly rose through the ranks due to his unmatched discipline, courage, and strategic brilliance. He was young, loyal, and astonishingly effective. In 533, Justinian sent him to North Africa with a relatively small force, perhaps 15,000 men, to take on the Vandals. It seemed an impossible task, but within a matter of months, Belisarius had accomplished what many thought unthinkable. He defeated the Vandal King Gelimer, recaptured Carthage, and restored Roman rule to Africa. The speed, efficiency, and decisiveness of the campaign astonished the world. Flushed with victory, Justinian turned his eyes to Italy. Belisarius was again deployed, this time against the Ostrogoths. What followed was a brutal, drawn-out conflict known as the Gothic War. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Belisarius battled not just enemy armies, but also rival generals, political obstacles, and the limitations placed on him by a jealous court. Still, he achieved remarkable successes, recapturing Sicily, Naples, and even Rome itself. He defended the Eternal City from multiple sieges and preserved its heritage at great personal cost. Yet despite his brilliance, Belisarius was often undermined, Justinian, wary of his general's popularity and influence, withheld reinforcements and curtailed his authority. Belisarius remained loyal even when humiliated. His victories were frequently won through sheer ingenuity and morale rather than numbers or resources. He was in many ways the last great Roman general, commanding with discipline, strategy, and a deep sense of honor. His campaigns brought the empire back to its former territories, at least temporarily. At its height, Justinian's reconquest restored direct imperial control over much of the western Mediterranean. Justinian himself was more than a dreamer. He was a tireless administrator, responsible for codifying Roman law into the famous Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal framework that would influence European systems for centuries. He built the Hagia Sophia symbol of imperial grandeur. He managed religious debates, suppressed revolts, and oversaw an imperial bureaucracy with ruthless precision. In many ways, Justinian embodied the Roman imperial ideal. But his obsession with reconquest strained the empire's finances, exhausted its armies, and ultimately proved unsustainable. When both men passed from history, Justinian in 565, Belisarius, shortly before the reconquered provinces began to slip away once again. Plague, internal strife, and new waves of invasion undid much of their achievements, but their legacy remained. For a brief window in the 6th century, the Roman Empire had against all odds risen from the ashes. Latin-speaking governors ruled in Carthage and Rome. Roman law was enforced across 2 continents, and for the first time in 100 years, people once again believed that the empire could be whole. Belisarius, in particular, earned the admiration of generations to come. Despite being repeatedly betrayed, he remained the model of Roman virtue, brave, disciplined, selfless, and just. His life became the subject of legend, his name synonymous with loyalty and genius. He fought not for power, but for an idea, an empire that had fallen, but not yet died. In the twilight between ancient and medieval, Justinian and Belisarius briefly rekindled Rome's dying flame. For that reason, both are often counted among the last Romans. Their struggle was not merely military, it was spiritual, a battle to remind the world of what Rome had once been and what it might still be. Pope Gregory the Great fought spiritual decay after Rome's decline. By the late 6th century, Rome was a ghost of its former self. The once great capital of the empire had suffered multiple sacks, plagues, and invasions. Its forums were overgrown, aqueducts crumbling, and population dwindling. Political authority had fragmented into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, and imperial governors were no longer seen or heard in the streets. Yet amidst this decay, a new kind of leadership emerged, not from emperors or generals, but from within the church. At the center of this transformation stood Gregory the Great, a Roman nobleman turned monk turned pope, who became the spiritual architect of post-imperial Europe. Born into a prominent senatorial family around 540 CE, Gregory originally, Gregorius Anicius, was raised on tales of Rome's grandeur. Educated in law and public affairs, he could have easily pursued a political career in what remained of Italy's administration. But instead, he chose a life of monasticism, dedicating himself to prayer, learning, and service. Even as the Lombards ravaged the countryside and famine stalked the cities, Gregory focused on preserving what he believed was Rome's true mission, not military conquest, but moral guidance. In 590 CE, during a time of great crisis, Gregory was elected pope. Rome was under siege from disease and war. The Byzantine authorities in Ravenna were distant and indifferent. The city, once the heart of the world, was leaderless and desperate. Gregory did not shrink from this responsibility. He became not only the religious head of Western Christendom, but also in practical terms the civil leader of Rome. He organized food distribution, negotiated with invading Lombards, repaired walls, and maintained civic services, all while guiding the spiritual life of the people. Gregory's reign as pope marked a turning point. He reshaped the papacy into a force that would endure for centuries, one rooted in service stability and outreach. He saw the church not merely as a guardian of faith, but as a vessel of Roman order. Where emperors had failed, bishops would step in. Through his writings, especially the pastoral rule and the numerous letters and sermons, Gregory established a model of Christian leadership grounded in humility, discipline, and intellectual rigor. His vision of a church-led society laid the foundation for medieval Christendom. One of Gregory's most ambitious initiatives was missionary outreach. Understanding that the old Roman frontiers could no longer be defended by armies, he sought to win hearts and souls instead. Most famously, he dispatched Augustine of Canterbury to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons in Britain, an island that had once been part of the Roman world, but had since fallen into tribal chaos. Gregory's hope was not to conquer Britain, but to spiritually reunify it with Rome, binding it once more to the legacy of civilization and order. And yet, despite his religious achievements, Gregory never forgot the Rome of old. He sought to preserve its memory in art, architecture, and tradition. He lamented the decay of its buildings and the loss of its libraries. But he also understood that the Roman identity had to evolve. He embraced the barbarian converts, encouraged the blending of Roman liturgy with local customs, and accepted that the empire's future would not be found in restored provinces, but in a united church. Because of this, Gregory is often considered one of the last true Romans. Not because he wore a toga or led legions into battle, but because he carried the spirit of Rome into a new age. In a time of disintegration, he provided cohesion. In a time of confusion, he offered clarity. And in an era when the empire had vanished from maps, he kept its values alive through compassion, order, discipline, and a relentless commitment to the common good. By the time of his death in 604 CE, Rome was no longer an imperial capital. But thanks to Gregory, it had become the capital of a new world, one shaped not by emperors, but by bishops and monks, monasteries, and manuscripts. The spiritual Rome he helped build would outlast kingdoms and empires, shaping European civilization for centuries. In this, Gregory the Great earned his name and his title as one of history's most enduring last Romans. Constantine XI died defending Constantinople, closing Rome's final chapter. Nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a final stand was made in the East, a last desperate defense of a world that had refused to die. In 1453, as the Ottoman armies surrounded the ancient walls of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, stood at the helm of a shattered empire. He was the last in a line of emperors, stretching back to Augustus, ruling over a realm that, though diminished in size, still carried the title of the Roman Empire. In name and law, and in cultural identity, Byzantium was Rome's direct descendant. And in Constantine XI, many saw the last Roman defiant in the face of annihilation. Born into the ruling Palaiologos dynasty, Constantine was crowned in 1449 amid a crumbling capital and an empire reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories. The once great Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as the Byzantine Empire, had endured invasions, plagues, civil wars, and crusades. It had watched the Western Empire vanish, the Balkans fall, and Anatolia turn Turkish. But Constantinople had always held firm until now. Sultan Mehmed II, young, brilliant, and determined, was assembling an army unlike any seen before. With advanced cannons, naval forces, and over 80,000 troops, he sought to finally bring Rome to an end. Inside the walls, Constantine commanded a vastly outnumbered force, no more than 7,000 defenders, including foreign volunteers, and a small contingent of Genoese allies. Supplies were low morale, uncertain, but the emperor refused to surrender. He organized defenses, inspired his troops, and personally stood atop the ramparts, directing strategy and fighting alongside his men. In the weeks of siege that followed, the city endured bombardments and waves of assaults. Still, it held. But on the 29th of May, 1453, the Ottomans launched a final, overwhelming attack. Breaches were made in the ancient Theodosian walls, and the defenders, exhausted and dwindling, were overrun. Constantine XI was last seen throwing off his imperial regalia and charging into the fray, sword in hand. His body was never recovered. His reported final words, "The city has fallen, but I am still alive," have echoed through history as a symbol of defiance. He died not as a passive ruler, but as a warrior king, fighting for a city that had been the heart of Rome for a millennium. The fall of Constantinople marked not just the end of a city, but the closing of an era. With it, the final political remnant of the Roman Empire ceased to exist. The institutions that had once governed half the known world were gone. The Senate, the legions, the emperors, all now belonged to the past. And yet in Constantine's final stand, the spirit of Rome shone one last time. He embodied the ancient virtues of courage, duty, and sacrifice that had defined the empire at its height. In him, the Roman soul found its final warrior. After the fall, Mehmed II entered the city and proclaimed it the new capital of his empire. Yet even he, in triumph, recognized the legacy he had inherited. He preserved many of the city's churches, converted others into mosques, and envisioned himself as a successor to the Roman emperors. In this strange twist, even Rome's conqueror saw value in its legacy. But the Roman line, as it had existed for 15 centuries, ended with Constantine XI. Today, Constantine stands not just as a national hero to Greece or a figure of Orthodox martyrdom, but as a symbol of historical continuity. His death did not erase Rome. It concluded its final chapter. Through him, the unbroken chain from Caesar to Justinian to the final defenders of Constantinople was sealed with blood and honor. Thus, the story of the Roman Empire, which began on the Palatine Hill, found its end on the battlements of Constantinople. And with the death of Constantine XI, the world said farewell to the last Roman. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single day, nor did it vanish with a single emperor's death. It faded gradually, like twilight, yielding to night. Yet even in its final moments, it produced men who carried its torch with courage and dignity. From battered frontiers to besieged capitals, from scholars in dimly lit monasteries to emperors dying on broken walls, these figures embodied the essence of Rome long after its political power had crumbled. The last Romans were not merely relics of a dying world, they were bridges to the future. Through their valor, writings, and sacrifices, the memory of Rome endured across centuries. In them, we see the final heartbeat of an ancient civilization and the enduring strength of its ideals. History may close their chapters, but their legacies continue to inspire. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Sleep Stories TV for more epic journeys into the past.